Hello, I'm Sean Gibbons. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Systems Biology, and this is my Google Autocomplete interview. All right, let's see what the first one says. Hopefully I don't rip the material. Wow, who is Sean Gibbons? It's a deep question, honestly. I'm a microbial ecologist, I guess, professionally speaking. I am from Montana, so I'm a ex-Montanan or a Montanan expat living in the state of Washington. I'm a professor. I'm a patron of the arts. I have a partner who's a filmmaker, and I've always enjoyed supporting the arts and film. And my father's a poet. Who am I? It's a good question. I contain multitudes, but for the purposes of this interview, I'm mostly a scientist doing research on the human gut microbiome. I think I might have preempted one of my next questions. How did Sean Gibbons get to where he is today? Another really complicated question. How did I get here? Well, it was a circuitous path. There wasn't a straight line. I didn't know I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up. When I was a kid, I had a lot of various interests. I was interested in the outdoors and the natural world. I grew up in Montana, so there was lots of forests and animals and plants. So I got into ecology and understanding how these invisible forces in our world are coalescing to create nature. And that invisible part I thought was really interesting. I was kind of into magic as a little kid. And then eventually I realized, magic isn't real, and the closest you can get is science. It's just kind of like grown-up magic. And an invisible thing that we can't see that kind of controls our universe is microbes. And so I got really excited about microbes at some point in my trajectory. When I was in college, I was studying everything from French literature to microbiology, and I was thinking about actually going to grad school for French literature, but ended up taking a job as a lab manager in my undergraduate research advisor's lab, worked on microbes growing in river sediments in Glacier National Park, fell in love with research, and then the rest is history. I did a master's degree, I did a PhD, I did a postdoc, and now I'm here running a lab at ISB. All right, what does Sean Gibbons research? Well, I gave away some of that already. I love microbes. I love microbial communities. I don't really care where they are. They could be in oceans or in soils. I just so happen to right now study microbes that live in poop just because. I don't exactly know why. I would be just as happy studying microbes anywhere else. You could solve problems in climate change. You could solve problems in bioengineering and manufacturing using microbial ecology. Our lab happens to focus on the microbes that live in humans, which allows us to potentially solve problems in human health, right? So if we can understand the rules of these microbial ecosystems well enough, we can begin to manipulate them and engineer the outputs of those systems and possibly affect human health, cure disease, prevent cancer, or improve cardiometabolic health, and so on. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to understand those rules well enough to be able to engineer the system to improve human health. All right, why is Sean Gibbons studying the gut microbiome? Again, I gave some of that away already, I think, in my prior answers. But it's a good practical question as well, right? Not just that I'm passionate about microbes and about science and learning about the universe, but why the human gut? So when I was a PhD student, I was actually studying the outer environment, like lakes and oceans and things like that. And when I moved into my postdoc, you start to think at that stage, maybe I want to be a professor someday. And when you run your own lab, you have to get money to fund your research. You have to write grants. And so I was thinking about, okay, what system do I want to work on in my postdoc? Because that's the stepping stone to a professor position. And I chose to work with a guy named Eric Alm at MIT, who happened to be studying the human gut microbiome and poop. And part of my calculus for making that decision was that the National Institutes of Health is a much larger pot of funding than the National Science Foundation. National Science Foundation, they fund the rivers and the lakes and all of that. Institutes of Health fund anything to do with the human body. So I figured it might be a little easier to fund a research program that focused on human health because there was just more resources available. And I'm happy either way. As long as I'm studying microbes, I'm happy. And if it can be a little bit easier in terms of getting money, why not go with poop? Of course, I also want to help cure disease and all that stuff too. But yeah. How can we take care of our microbiomes? You got to start thinking like a microbe. What are they doing? What are they eating? What do they like? The human gut has evolved to be, at least the colon part, has evolved to be a big bioreactor that microbes can live in, and they can grow anaerobically, ferment substrates into other substrates. So there's no oxygen, so aerobic respiration, like what we do with breathing and all that, that's not available to our microbes. They have to do something else. They use fermentation. And there are various things they can eat to ferment and get their energy. One are dietary fibers. So when you eat an apple or when you eat a vegetable, some amount of that vegetable and fruit material is what's called indigestible to us. We don't have the genes to break down some of those compounds in those foods, but our microbes do. So microbes actually have 100 times more genes in the microbiome than there are genes in the human genome. And a lot of those genes are involved in breaking down these substrates that are in the foods we eat. So people have different responses to foods, and it's because of the activity of these microbes, because we all have different microbiomes. So they eat fiber, that's one thing they eat. They can also ferment proteins and other compounds that are in our diets. But it's ideal if they're fermenting fiber, because if they start fermenting other things like proteins, they can actually kind of produce toxins that build up in our system. So you should eat your fiber, eat your veggies, do it, grandma told you, eat your leafy greens, your fruits, and your vegetables. That generally keeps you pretty healthy in terms of your microbiome. Another piece of this puzzle, and a dangerous thing even to think about here, is if you're not feeding your microbes, they're going to eat something. They're starving down there. What are they going to eat? They're going to eat you, because we actually produce a fibrous substrate. It's called mucus. So when you sneeze, that slimy stuff, our bodies are making these complex polysaccharides, and we also make a version of that mucus that lines the interior of our gut, and it helps protect us from being exposed to our microbes. If they get too close to our tissue, our immune system goes crazy and starts to attack them. So we build a little wall that maintains a détente between us and the microbes. Now, if we stop eating dietary fiber, the microbes are looking around, trying to find something to eat. They can't find anything, so they just start munching away at that mucus layer, which gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner until it gets so thin that it causes all these problems like inflammatory bowel disease. So next time you're sitting down to a meal, remember that you should feed your microbes in addition to feeding yourself. Consume those substrates that the microbes need to eat. Okay. What does a usual day look like for Sean Gibbons? It looks like completely different things every day. That's part of why I enjoy my job. The things I do each day are kind of all over the map. Some days I schedule a completely free day with no meetings when I need to write. So a lot of my job is writing. Those of you burgeoning scientists out there, you should realize that a big part of being a scientist, especially at the leadership level, is being fast, efficient, and good at writing things. So practice up your writing. I spend a lot of my time writing, and for that you need protected time because you need long stretches where you can kind of just sit, think, and write. Then I'll often try to pile up my meetings into a single day. Right? You could cut up your whole week if you're just meeting here and there all the time. So I try to schedule like a couple of days a week where I have a lot of meetings with students or other professors or collaborators. So I get those all scheduled kind of back to back, get all those meetings out of the way for that week, and then leave the rest of the time in the week as protected time to just sit and think. Occasionally, I actually get my hands dirty and do a little science myself. There's less and less of that these days. Usually it's the students and the postdocs in the lab that are actually pipetting things in the lab or writing code and doing analyses. But every now and then I try to do that. And usually what I try to do there is I try to find new projects. So I'll do an analysis kind of preliminary to see if there's any cool association that I hypothesize might be there. And I'll find something that looks kind of promising, and then suddenly that becomes a project that a student can take and run away with. I don't want to finish anything. I'm not trying to steal projects from my people. I'm just trying to de-risk ideas. So writing, grants, papers, mentoring, having meetings, and then doing a little bit of science is kind of my normal week. Apart from that, we do a lot of traveling as academics. I go to conferences a lot. I give a lot of talks all over the world. And so there's a fair amount of like zipping around all over the place and giving talks. Nope. Next one. What advice does Sean Gibbons have for current high school, does it keep going, and college students who are passionate about science? Good question. So when I was in high school, I was in a public school, but I was lucky. There was a course called Advanced Problems in Science in my particular high school, where they gave me an entire period every day to work on a science fair project. So I just went and thought about a project, put it together. I got a little bit of a budget. One of my first projects was looking at the antimicrobial activity of essential oils. So I was testing lemon oil and orange oil and eucalyptus on E. coli and Bacillus subtilis and a few other bacteria. So that was really great, and it kind of gave me a taste for the process of doing science. So if you see opportunities for doing that kind of a thing when you're in high school, and in college, right? If you're in college and you take a class from a professor you think is really interesting, and you go up and ask, is there any opportunity to maybe, work in your lab? And it usually starts off at a low level. I started off as a dishwasher in a lab, the lowest of the low. I was just washing dishes, but every now and then I got opportunities to do things and do experiments and play around, and then eventually I kept moving up the rung. I became a lab manager as an undergrad and got to do all kinds of fun science. So look around for opportunities to explore different types of science. Try a lot of different things, because you don't quite know what you'll love until you try many things out. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, what makes a good scientist is someone who's really curious. They're curious about other people. They're curious about literature. They're curious about art. They're just curious minds that are constantly searching and looking. And I think you want to be well-rounded to be a great scientist. A great scientist is able to communicate their ideas to other people in a fluent, flowing way that allows you to, kick your science up to another level. There are examples of scientists from history who've been incredibly quantitatively smart, but their findings have been lost for decades because they get published in some obscure paper, very pretentious, written in a very opaque way, and they're really hard to understand. And it takes years later, when someone else picks it up and reads it and can finally articulate it in a more palatable way, that those ideas kind of make it out into the world, and then they get more associated with the person who could articulate it than it was with the person who originally came up with it. So become the kind of scientist who likes to read literature, who loves to write, who can be articulate, both in your mathematics, but also in your language. And I think that is going to make you into a great scientist. Okay, and what are Sean Gibbons's goals right now? Good question. They're always changing. There are so many things going on. There's so many cool projects in the lab. I think I'll just pick one and say, we've been thinking for a long time about how do you engineer the microbiome. It's this really complicated system. Everybody's got a different set of species. If you feed in a banana to 10 different people's microbiomes, totally different chemicals come out the other end. And if you change something, if you try to take out a species or add one in, it's hard to predict the repercussions of those interventions, because there's indirect ripple effects throughout the whole system. It's like a game of pickup sticks, and you touch one little piece and the rest can kind of move and fall apart. So it's really hard to engineer, right? It's really hard to predict outputs. But we've recently built some tools that allow you to do that. So we have these things called community scale metabolic models that allow us to kind of take the metabolic networks of microbes living in someone's gut, pull them down into a kind of digital twin of a person's microbiome and simulate in silico their metabolism in terms of what the microbes can do. And then we can feed in different diets into this digital twin and predict outputs. And some of these outputs are really important for human health. Like butyrate is like a drug, essentially. It regulates blood pressure. It helps reduce prediabetes and diabetes. It prevents cancer. It does all these really good things for you. And if you can turn it up, you can essentially prevent a lot of chronic disease. So at the moment, one of our goals is to take these models. We've done some proof of concepts to show that they kind of work and deploy them in human clinical trials where we design personalized dietary interventions for individual people and show that we can do better than the sort of standard of care, right? If you just feed people a Mediterranean diet, that's pretty good for most people, but some people don't respond so well to that diet. What if we made someone a specific diet just for them, and do those specific diets perform better than just a Mediterranean diet? If we can prove that, I think we sort of can revolutionize this space of precision nutrition. So that is a goal over the next 5 to 10 years, is to take some of these sci-fi tools that we're developing and see if they actually work in the wild with real people. So what is Sean Gibbons' favorite book, movie, / TV show? All of the above, I suppose. That's a really hard question, and I can be snarky and give you the Fran Lebowitz answer. I don't know if you know Fran Lebowitz, but yeah, she's like a wit in New York City who walks around saying things. But she has a particular witticism that favorites are for children, right? That if you've sampled the world and you're a cosmopolitan, human Renaissance person, you probably don't necessarily have favorites because you've tried so many things, and there's so many great things that on different axes might be your favorite, but there's no single one that pops out as favorite. So that's like the lazy, snarky answer. I do read a lot, so I love literature. I do watch a lot of film. My partner is a filmmaker, actually, in New York City, and I love good TV as well. And so I don't have favorites, but I could come up with maybe a few that I've sort of recently read that might be of interest. So let's see. In terms of books, I recently read a book called The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut, French author. But he writes in English, at least this book he does. And it's about a guy named John von Neumann, who is sort of the father of modern computing. Back in the 40s, 50s, he built Turing actually hypothesized a universal computing machine, but he never actually built it. And von Neumann built it. It was called The Maniac, and it was at the Advanced Institute of Study at Princeton. And it was used for some not great purposes, like they did the first simulations to prove that a hydrogen bomb would work. So he was a part of the Manhattan Project. But kind of a really crazy smart person, but also sort of amoral and had like a weird past, and he sort of envisioned artificial intelligence. And so the book kind of goes through his life and then talks a bit about how some of his ideas are currently playing out in all the AI type stuff we're seeing these days. I actually put it on the bookshelf here at ISB. There's an intern bookshelf, so it should be there to read. A movie, let's see. It's hard to pick a movie, but one that's on the top of my mind because I saw it fairly recently is I rewatched a Jim Jarmusch movie. I like Jim Jarmusch. I think he's a great filmmaker. And he had a movie called Dead Man that was made, I think, back in the late 90s. The soundtrack is by Neil Young. It's purely instrumental. It's just Neil Young playing around on an electric guitar. It's about a kind of nerdy functionary type guy on the East Coast who gets a letter that he's inherited something in, I think, San Francisco or something on the West Coast, and he takes the train out and sort of, discovers a completely alien world. The main character is Johnny Depp, young Johnny Depp, before he kind of went crazy with all the stuff that happened in the 2000s. Great movie, Dead Man. And then TV show, I'll stick to the Dead theme. And I'm also reading Lincoln and the Bardo, which also has a dead theme to it. And so there's a show called 6 Feet Under from, I think, the late 90s, early 2000s on HBO. It's about a family who runs a funeral home. The beginning of every episode is someone's death, and then it flashes back to the main plot. But you get a intro of every episode of someone dying, and then their body is the one being processed at the funeral home. And it's just very subtle, very beautiful, very well done. And I could talk for the next 3 hours about books, movies, and TV shows, but I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.